You are listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming to you now from a secure and well-disclosed location in downtown Spokane. It's Long Waves with Gary Krug. And here's the disclaimer. The opinions expressed on this show are solely my own and are not necessarily the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. So thank you so much for joining me again today. I'm going to be digressing a bit from the usual format. I'm going to be spending less time talking about specifics of news and more time contemplating the American soul in its current state. So, what do I mean by that? I mean that increasingly, both the government and the American populace act as if they are possessed by dark forces that drive them to behave strangely. And by possession, I'm not referring to demonic possession. I'm not referring to some kind of supernatural spirits welling out of hell or heaven or wherever. I mean possession in the sense of psychology, that we are playing with some forces in our mind. We're denying parts of our existence. And I want to tease this apart as I go through the show today. I look at the current conflicts around the world, particularly with ISIS. And it strikes me, if we listen carefully to what we're saying about ISIS, ISIS is, in one sense, our shadow. Now, I want to use shadow in a very precise term. Very precise way. I want to use it in the sense of depth psychology, the psychology of, say, James Hillman, using some of the ideas originally proposed by the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung early in the 20th century, well, through most of the 20th century. The key notion is that there are concepts, there are entities in our minds that Jung called archetypes, and Hillman uses the same term, as do a number of neo-Jungians. Archetypes, these are autonomous processes in our minds, generally unconscious, but they have their own intentions, they have their own fates, they have their own dramas that they act out through us. And if you think for a minute, it's not as strange as it sounds. If you think about all of the irrational movements that overtake us, all of the irrational feelings that fill our minds, we think about depression or mania. And the tendency these days is to reduce our symptoms, our pathologies, to medical causes or to something that needs treatment. Jung and Hillman go a different way with this. It's not treatment per se that is required. It's not treatment that would help the Americans come to awareness of the great evil that they perpetrate, that we perpetrate, while pretending to be and fully believing ourselves to be completely good and wholesome people. One of the archetypes is the shadow. And the shadow is all of those dark sides of ourselves that we don't like to become aware of. We don't like to remind ourselves of our history, remind ourselves of our own, of feelings, of ideas, of images, of histories that conflict with the idea consciousness wants to have of itself. And most people think they are only what they know of themselves. And as Carl Jung once wrote, in so thinking that they are only what consciousness knows of itself, they compound stupidity with iniquity. When I talk about the shadow, I mean these projections of an inner darkness. Let me explain it. Let me give you a simple example. I'm sure everyone who's listening has had the experience at some point in your life of meeting a person who, upon sight, you instantly detest. For no good reason, completely irrationally, you loathe this person. You're filled with irrational feelings of anger and dislike. That's the shadow. And what it's telling us is there's something inside of us that we're not conscious of, that we need to become aware of. And one of the mechanisms that the mind uses to make us aware is to disturb consciousness with these outward projections of an inner darkness. And we see this all over today, especially in this fascination with Islamophobia, especially with this obsession with Islamophobia. Islamophobia exists to the extent that people have ill-formed, juvenile, and poorly understood ideas of their own existence, ideas of their own faith, ideas of their own identity, and the identity of their nation. As Hillman once remarked, quote, "An axiom of depth psychology asserts that what is not admitted into awareness erupts in ungainly, obsessive, literalist ways." Our demons, then, reside in those that we obsess over. Our demons reside in those whom we fear, whom we despise, whom we are fascinated with. And this points to an opportunity to gain self-awareness about our own dark side. Let me give you some examples. I stumbled over a fascinating article by Ira Chernis on Tom Dispatch. Ira Chernis is a professor of theology at Colorado State University. I wrote a lovely little piece published on Tom Dispatch called "America's Reckless War Against Evil, Why It's Self-Defeating and Has No End." Right? And he points out that right back with Bush, with Obama, we have the face of evil, we have the evildoers. And Bush launched a war against them. It continued for 8 years. Obama continued the war. And how did the war against the evildoers work out for us? Well, Chernis says not quite the way you expected, right? I bet you didn't imagine that your global war on terror would plant the seeds of an Islamic State and turn significant stretches of Iraq and Syria into fertile soil in which ISIS would continue to grow into a brand new and even more frightening enemy. But that's the way wars against evil always seem to work. He continues, "It drives me crazy to watch policymakers and experts making the same dumb mistakes time after time. Several mistakes, actually, which synergistically add up to one self-defeating blunder after another. What's worse? The dominant trend in public opinion is so often on the side of just those mistakes." And this is a key point. You'd think someone would learn something. And in that someone, I include we the people, the nation as a whole. Yet now, you guessed it, we're doing it all over again. And he lists the 5 mistakes that we routinely make in this. Mistake number 1, treating our enemy as absolute evil, not even human. And we do this all the time. We did this in World War II. We represented the Japanese as fanatical, insane, subhuman creatures. The enemy is always represented as something less than human because it makes it easier to kill them. But also it is a projection off onto them of the things we don't want to recognize of ourselves. We take all of our evil, all of our darkness, all of the unexamined little horrors that dwell in the American psyche, and we project them outward. We project them outward. So Ben Carson, calls ISIS a bunch of rabid dogs. Ted Cruz calls them scorpions. Donald Trump calls them insane and animals. Obama called the Paris bombing an attack on all humanity, and Chernis notes, which means that even for the president, ISIS fighters stand outside that category. So they're not human. And this is dangerous. This is exceedingly dangerous. Since we are human and they are not, we are opposite in every way, writes Chernis. If they are absolute evil, we must be the absolute opposite. It's the old apocalyptic tale, God's people versus Satan's. And we see this tale acted out all around us at all levels, at a national level, at an international level, in the psyches of ordinary people walking in the street. We see it on TV. This mad rush toward an apocalypse that will finally resolve everything and eliminate all the darkness and eliminate all the fears and concerns, except it won't. It won't. It feeds into this national idea of exceptionalism, the indispensable country, the indispensable nation, the only nation capable of leading the world. We're not. We're not. And history teaches us there's no such thing as an indispensable country. All countries are dispensable, including this one. So, back to Chernis. This leads us to mistake number 2. Buried in the assumption that the enemy is not in any sense human like us, is absolution for whatever hand we may have had in sparking or contributing to evil's rise and spread. Right? We didn't bring about ISIS. Oh, no, when all the evidence says that we did. Stacks of evidence. The entire history of the last 20 years and longer in the Middle East points to precisely this: denial of our own hand in creating the horror we now confront. But that's the way the unconscious works. We don't want to be conscious. We resist it. We fight it. We want to bury all of these frightening ideas so far down that we never have to actually let go and confront who we are. Which leads us to Chernis's point number 3. He says, call it blotting out history. We lose the ability to really understand the enemy because we ignore the actual history of how that enemy came to be and how we play a central role in this. He suggests that we do this to sustain our image of ourselves as innocents in the whole affair. And to do this, we have to, quote, blot out this empirical history and replace it with a myth. Block out the empirical history of what happened and have this myth about the crazy them and the good peace-loving us. Which leads us to mistake number 4. We assume that the enemy, like Lucifer himself, does evil just for the sake of doing it. Right? So you can't actually think about the enemy's actual motives, whether they have political agendas, which they do, trust me. Instead, they're just lunatics bent on slaughter. They're mad dogs. They're rabid, as we've already pointed, just like Lucifer himself. And even to suggest that our enemy might not be Lucifer himself is almost blasphemy. And it certainly causes a great deal of reaction from people in the world. Mistake number 5, to convince ourselves that the Islamic State is evil incarnate, we imagine that the enemy is relentless, intractable, and implacable as the devil himself. As a result, we also imagine that nothing we could do might diminish their will to evil. So they're just crazy. There's no rationality. Can't work with them. Can't deal with them. And that leads us to mistake number 6. The belief that we only have the option to annihilate the enemy. Bomb them all back to the Stone Age. Crush them. Destroy this brutal and barbaric regime. And on and on and on. Which we know, historically, creates this cycle of violence, a spiral of violence. And more violence creating more violence. And more chaos creating more chaos. And this war against evil, war against the terrorists that we've been doing for how long now? 16 years? Almost. We seem to be locked only more closely into this cycle of violence. Chernis reflects on his thoughts here a minute. He says, I wonder that the answer to such questions may lie in what I've called the American myth of national insecurity. It tells us we will always be at war with evildoers bent on destroying us, that this war, whichever war, is the meaning and mission of our nation, and the only way to feel like a real American is to enlist permanently in permanent war. The longer we fight, he writes, the more deeply we are seized by fear. The more we fear, the more fiercely we are determined to fight. Perhaps the point is not to win the war, but to remain trapped in this vicious circle, which feels perversely comforting because it offers a sense of unified national identity as nothing else can in our otherwise deeply divided nation. There is some truth to that. There is some truth to that. Our insights are impotent, or we have no insights at all. Our minds, feelings, wills, and behavior deviate from normal ways, writes James Hillman in his book Revisioning Psychology. Our feelings disappear in apathy. We worry and also don't care. Destruction seeps out of us autonomously, and we cannot redeem the broken trusts, hopes, loves. And so we deny our role in the broken dreams, the broken hopes, the broken trusts, the broken promises. We deny our role in violence. We deny our role in murder so that we can maintain the fantasy that somehow we're special, somehow we are different, somehow we are better, which makes, of course, everyone else worse. This is the ugly American syndrome at its best. And this is the movement of archetypes. In 1936, just before World War II, Carl Jung wrote an essay called Wotan. Now, Wotan is an old Nordic god who always causes trouble. He's always associated with windstorms, with wandering about, with destruction. He's a very interesting character. And Jung said, I could see everywhere the manifestations of the spirit of Wotan. Not that, he was talking about a real Nordic god, not one in the world anyway, but one that lived in the minds, the psyches of the German people, and that transformed them. How was it exactly that the most civilized, educated, cultured nation in Europe fell into such darkness? Was it not a form of communal possession? An archetype. I look at the fascinations, I look at the obsessions we have in this country, the obsession with control. That's what the gun stuff is all about. People think if they have guns, the gun will serve as some sort of magic talisman against any kind of evil that confronts them. And if they just have enough of these magic talismans about their body, then they are somehow protected from a fate that would otherwise befall them. Well, this is a nonsense on the face of it. This is magical thinking. But it does point to the heart of a fascination with killing and destruction and violence that this country has. Whether it's our sports, our movies, our international policy, our reaction to hurt, there is a fascination with violence and obsession. And again, obsessions come from the unconscious. This is something begging to be heard, something begging to be brought into consciousness and understood. I don't know how many of my listeners remember the movie Taxi Driver with De Niro. The character of Travis, I believe was his name, the taxi driver, was completely bifurcated. He had two, in many ways, identical but morally different aspects to his mind. On the one hand, he is the person who is going to assassinate a political figure, enact his obsession in that form of violence. And on the other hand, he wants to be the savior of the young prostitute, the young woman trafficked into prostitution in the film, which he does by killing the people oppressing her. He solves both. The actions of each pole are extreme violence. And this reveals the dual nature of possession, that it has a light side and it has a dark side, a predatory side. So we have predators and heroes, light and dark. Let's look at another aspect of, another bit of evidence for this possession that I'm speaking about. I look at our films. I look at our television. I look at our porn. I look at our wars. I look at our fascination with death, our fascination with extreme sports, whether witnessed vicariously or participated in. And in all of this, I see ratcheting up of intensities. It's not a good American film if a lot of things don't explode and a lot of people yell and guns are fired. The TV always has to be a little more intense, push us a bit more, or be so soporific that it numbs the mind and we just don't care. Look at the fascination with porn. Porn is all about intensities. And as Deleuze and Guattari noted in their book, A Thousand Plateaus, intensities dissolve the sense of a self. It dissolves the me, the moi, in the French. And Hillman concurs with that, writing, again from revisioning psychology, whenever the importance of experience is determined only by intensity, by absoluteness, by ecstatic godliness or God nearness, and is self-validating, there is a risk of possession by an archetypal person and a manic inflation. Whenever the importance of the experience is determined only by its intensity, by absoluteness, by ecstatic godliness, then there's a real risk of possession. And this is how we live. This is how our culture works. This is how we entertain ourselves. It's got to be bigger, better, brighter, more intense, more intense. And always, it seems to, these activities seem to exist to ward off introspection, to ward off the pain that comes with self-examination, the difficulty of that. To ward off, finally, let's put a word on it, suffering. Because suffering is the domain of the soul. And we don't like suffering, but it's essential to health. We don't like soul. We like spirit. We don't like culture, which would be soul. We like civilization, which is spirit. We've sacrificed culture to civilization. Quoting Hillman again, civilization works, culture flowers. We're all about the tech. We're all about the gadgets. We're all about the cars and planes and blah, blah, blah. But we're not about the inner depth, the depth of the soul, the depth of culture. How many people read books, real books? How many people have pulled their cable plug and instead gone back to reading, talking, entertaining themselves with friends perhaps? What are we hiding from? I suggest that by and large Americans have lost a sense of the future. They don't see, they have trouble projecting themselves or their children into a world that looks like the world they're from. They have trouble seeing a future that looks like it might actually exist. And this is a rather terrifying thing. You know, look how often in the political sector especially we talk about, are we on the right path or are we on the wrong path? What a ridiculous question. What a completely ridiculous question. In terms of what? In terms of what? So we escape into our gadgets, we escape into our intensities, we escape into our wars, we escape into our fears, we escape into our symptoms. We escape into our symptoms, our obsessions, our anger, our hatred, our envy, Didn't I do a whole show on the 7 deadly sins not too long ago? I think I did. We deny nature, which is linked more closely with culture than it is with civilization. Look at climate change. Look at climate change. What civilization would deny nature in such a way? What civilization would transform nature into an object without life or being? Pure spirit, no soul. How many hunters thank the deer for their sacrifice? How many fishermen thank the fish or the lake? It's that soulful relationship with the world that is required to heal us. Instead, we rush into civilization. We talk a lot about civilization. Just as we are now fighting one final desperate battle to save the current manifestation of empire, well, civilizations fall. Cultures outlive civilizations. And if a civilization falls and there is no culture, there's really nothing to preserve, is there? Rome fell. Greece fell. Their cultures continue. Their cultures continue to exist in our world in very real ways. But the civilizations are gone. If we cannot imagine a future, perhaps it is that we have lost imagination. We have lost the ability to imagine because we're too busy not confronting those dark archetypes within us. We have no experience of the archetype. Nobody teaches us this. Nobody teaches healthy depth psychology in high school. Well, that's just nonsense. You don't need to know that stuff. Well, actually, you do. In one form or another. It doesn't have to be that form. But in one form or another, either through culture, or through art, or through meditation, or through music, the soul must exist and must be prized above civilization. But without imagination, everything becomes literal. There's no metaphor anywhere. Everything becomes nominal. And it seems to be where we are. Where does imagination come from? It's not one of those things you can force to occur. It's not one of those things you can demand appear. The muses sing or they do not. And this has nothing to do with what consciousness wants, what our ego wants. We credit our ego and its extension through technology. But we never plumb the depths of our own psyche, of our own minds. We just don't do it. But this is who we are. We reduce the soul, the archetypal vision, the imagination of seeing others as ourselves and seeing ourselves as others, of seeing our good, our bad, and owning it, knowing it, chatting with it. But we take that and we convert it into a projection of our ego, manifested by speaking some words, invoking some name, proclaiming some phrase. And this is never a good thing. This just never works out well. Yeah, I remember a passage that I'd found in Carl Jung's book, The Spiritual Problems of Modern Man. Jung writes that the Western world is in a precarious situation, and the danger is greater, quote, the more we blind ourselves to the merciless truth with illusions about our beauty of soul. Western man lives in a thick cloud of incense, which he burns to himself so that his own countenance may then be veiled from him in smoke. But how do we strike men of another color? What do China and India think of us? What feelings do we arouse in the black man? And what about all those whom we rob of their lands and exterminate with rum and venereal disease? I have an American Indian friend who's a Pueblo chieftain, continuing Jung. Once when we were talking confidentially about the white man, he said to me, quote, we don't understand the whites. They're always wanting something, always restless, always looking for something. What is it? We don't know. We can't understand them. They have such sharp noses, such thin, cruel lips, and such lines in their faces. We think they're all crazy. My friend had recognized, without being able to name it, the Aryan bird of prey and its insatiable lust to lord in every land, even those that concern him not at all. And he had also noted the megalomania of ours, which leads us to suppose, among other things, that Christianity is the only truth and the white Christ the only Redeemer. After setting the whole East in turmoil with our science and technology and exacting tribute from it, we send our missionaries even to China. The comedy of Christianity in Africa is really pitiful. There the stamping out of polygamy, no doubt highly pleasing to God, has given rise to prostitution on such a scale that in Uganda alone 20,000 pounds annually are spent on preventatives of venereal infection. And the good European pays his missionaries for these edifying achievements. Need we also mention the story of the suffering of Polynesia, the blessings of the opium trade? This is how the European looks when he's extracted from this cloud of moral incense. No wonder that unearthing the psyche is like undertaking a full-scale drainage operation. And boy, isn't that the case, a full-scale drainage operation. I look at the world events. I look at how various countries act. I look at how Russia has been acting regarding Syria and ISIS. Russia has been rational. Russia has been forthright. Russia has acted openly and honestly. I'll give you an example. You recall the Su-34 that was shot down by Turkey with the U.S. involvement, and and it was plainly a trap set for the Russians. It was Turkey and NATO wanting to give the Russians a message and to say, oh, you're not going to retaliate, are you? You're not going to retaliate. This shows you're weak. See everybody in NATO? You see how weak Russia is? They won't retaliate. But I don't see this as weakness. I see this as wisdom. I don't think the Russians are weak. I don't think they want a war. But I don't think they're weak. But you can see this game. It's the schoolyard game of the bully. I hit him. He didn't hit me back. You see what a punk he is? So Russia's recovered the flight data recorders from the Su-34 that was shot down. And they want to open them in front of a military tribunal, in front of, an international tribunal of experts. Wow. How cool is that? A tribunal of experts. So everybody could get the data at the same time and go, look, you see, we're not pulling your leg. We're not making this up. This is not propaganda. This is not propaganda. And I look at the reaction of the West. It is so unconscious. All it can do is to project onto the Russians the most evil possible images. Because this is our psychology. And we will continue to play this game to our own destruction, if not the destruction of the world, until we grow up. Until we grow up. Carl Jung wrote elsewhere, quote, because the behavior of a race takes on its specific character from its underlying images, we can speak of an archetype, that is, an autonomous psychic factor. So what are our underlying images? What are our underlying images? Genocide? A civil war? What are our underlying images? And if we don't understand what they are, if we don't understand that not long after, we just had Thanksgiving, didn't we? Not long after the original Thanksgiving, those very pilgrims were chopping the heads off of Indians and murdering them in their hundreds. The entire country was stolen from the first people. And now we steal the entire world. We haven't even admitted that to ourselves. Okay, some people did some bad stuff once upon a time, and like we should all go boo-hoo-hoo. You see the problem with that mindset? You see the problem with that lack of insight? We have to defend our ego, don't we? We have to defend our group. And this is another one of the reasons we love wars. Because wars, as the earlier author noted, wars do, in fact, increase bonding. They do increase the sense of the group. They absolutely do that. And since we have no real soul to bring us together, because we have no real culture in which meaningful social life could take place, we love the one mechanism we have, which is war. Which is war. Manifests itself as this drive to control and dominate. What would it look like in the individual? Well, we see it all around us. And don't our ordinary selves both experience and enact this drive to bond through control and domination? Do we not see this in our nation? Is this not part of the doctrine of our leaders and their parties? Does this not percolate down to the streets and embody itself in the lives of ordinary people? The U.S. helped to create the United Nations and now mocks it because it speaks in voices that challenge and condemn the hubris and the avarice of empire. We in America despise the meek. We despise the weak. We despise the least among us and piously affirm our faith in Jesus. Affirm our faith in being the one essential country. Sorry if y'all get stepped on. We're making history here. We are seized by the darkness of our shadow, and delighting only in excess, paralyzed by fear, largely true, that our future will not be like our past. People rush to the demagogues, Trump and Cruz and the rest of them. They rush to the demagogues who promise that which can never be fulfilled or delivered. The demagogues promise that the dream will be reborn without our having to change, without our having to grow, without our having to become self-aware. You know, the U.S. psyche is like the ego defense of a serial killer. I had to kill him. I had to kill them all. We're back to Travis from Taxi Driver. I'm going to do good. Well, maybe not. The violence is violence, regardless of how it enacts itself. And this violence, as I say, it does preserve the self, the status quo. It reinforces group identification. It reinforces power. But it involves an absolute abnegation of thought and awareness. We don't realize how big our death wish is. You remember Robert Oppenheimer, the leader of the Los Alamos project to develop the nuclear bomb. When the bomb first went off on that day in June 1945, Oppenheimer said he was reminded of the words from the Bhagavad Gita of Hindu scripture, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. This civilization worships death. And it races toward an apocalypse which people literally believe will convey them to heaven as a physical place. We've created ourselves in the dark nihilism of Al-Qaeda and Daesh. We're their shadow. They're our shadow. We battle our image, ourself. Our projection. And always there is that sense of hubris, that sense of we're better, we're above all that. We hold our civilization higher. Well, look at the blessings we've given the world. Atomic bombs, concentration camps, drone warfare, Guantanamo, torture. And when we pretend that our doing of these things does not define us, but we know they do, and so does everyone else. We suffer from a collective guilt on a kind of archaic and primitive level, and where else are we? A collective guilt, a state of magical purity. And all of our uncleanliness, all of our sin, all of our guilt, we project out into the world. This is why our peculiar brands of nationalism, exceptionalism, and the vending machine versions of Jesus who frees us from all sins, this is why we develop these particular forms. We have no stomach for the truth. We have no stomach for understanding that we are connected to our fellows that we share a conscious humanity and an unconscious humanity. But it seems so alien to us, so far away, so hard to grasp, so hard to bring into being. It's just too much for us. But it doesn't have to be. This is the key point. It doesn't have to be. We can become conscious. We can grow. We can become self-aware. We can stop projecting our own, our own evils and failures onto other people. Because then we simply lock ourselves into this death battle with our shadow. And you can never kill your shadow. You can't even wound your shadow. And the fact that you try reveals that you are already wounded. I don't know what dark god is working through the American psyche, but I do know the dark collective guilt of the American psyche. And the only thing that will rid this country of its obsessive madness, if anything will be a recognition of that collective guilt. That's the only thing it's the only card we have left. I wish we had more. It just doesn't seem to be the case, you know? It just doesn't seem to be the case. Jung wrote, when any natural human function gets lost, that is denied consciousness and intentional expression, a general disturbance results. Here it is quite natural that with the triumph of the goddess of reason, a general neuroticizing of modern man should set in, a dissociation of personality analogous to the splitting of the world today, at that time into the Iron Curtain and the so-called free nations, and now it's the West and everybody else. But there's a bifurcation, there's that split. This boundary line, bristling with barbed wire, runs through the psyche of modern man, no matter on which side he lives. And just as the typical neurotic is unconscious of his shadow side, so the normal individual, like the neurotic, sees his shadow in his neighbor, or in the man beyond the great divide. Sees his shadow in his neighbor or in the person beyond the great divide. What else are we doing with ISIS? ISIS is our shadow. War is our collective guilt. And the only way out of it is to experience it, experience our symptoms, experience our guilt. The only way out is to experience our fear. The only way out is to experience our anxiety at the precariousness of the future. But the future has always been precarious. And besides, what else are we doing? Why don't we be about this? It seems unlikely, but hope springs eternal. Anyway, this concludes today's show. Thank you so much for joining me here on Long Waves Radio on KYRS. I'm going to tell you about the plug now. If you have a car, truck, boat, you can donate it to us. It's easy. We'll put it to use and you get a tax deduction. If you call KYRS CAR, C-A-R, 855-597-7227. We'll arrange free pickup. You'll get a nice tax deduction. We'll get a few pennies to keep the station running. So any old vehicle doesn't even have to run. Car, boat, truck, whatever. 855-597-7227. I'll be back next week with another show. Thank you again for listening. And you are listening to KYRS Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM. Feel your symptoms. I'll be back next week.